Well, it is already that time where we are going to wrap up the first month of 2024. Hey, it's Hope. I am going to break this video up into two parts because, as is well known to anybody who has been here before, I rely very heavily on the library, which makes monthly reading wrap-ups difficult to have the physical copies because a lot of the times the books have to have been returned. So in order to get around that, I'm going to try to do like mid-month filming, but I'm going to put it all together at the end of the video, at the end of the month into one video. So this is going to be split up. I have, I think, 8 books to talk about. I have most of them in physical form. They're all going to be due back by the end of the month. Let's just get into it. I'm just going to go in the order that I have them sitting here. First up, we have Shark Heart, A Love Story by Emily Hebeck. I actually have an entire video on this because it was a challenge to see how quickly I could read this book. But this, so I won't talk a lot about it, but this book follows Ren and Lewis, who are married. And it turns out that Lewis has this condition where he's going to start turning into a shark. And you go through that process with them. And then you flash back to Ren and her mother, Angela. And you know in the beginning part of the story that something has happened between Ren and her mother, but you don't know what. It's very vague. And then as you read the story, you figure out what occurred between Ren and Angela. And it goes from there. I liked the story enough, but I do feel like it wasn't exactly for me. Like it wasn't, it was written very heartfelt, and I am not a heartfelt girl. So I struggled with that a little bit. I can see why people would be emotionally invested in what happened in this book. It does get sad. You feel bad for this woman who is losing her husband to this disease, and there's nothing you can do about it. I think that probably there is some sort of metaphor for something that is bigger than what I realized, because I am very much normally just a surface level reader. So this one wasn't the greatest book for me, but I did enjoy it enough. It was good. I can understand why the premise would have built up quite a bit of hype around this book because it is quite a unique story. It just wasn't my favorite, but it wasn't the worst. I would say if it's on your radar, it would probably still be worth picking up. Next up, we have A Saint from Texas by Edmund White. This book follows 2 twins, Yvette and Yvonne, although you are mostly with Yvonne. Yvette comes into the story, but mostly through letters. She has a couple of lengthy letters that takes place. And they're from Texas. Like I said, they're twins, and they move in very different directions. Yvonne ends up in Paris, and Yvette ends up as like a missionary, a nun down in Colombia. Here's the thing about this book. I think I could have loved this book, except that I feel like I've been slumping a little bit in my reading lately, and this isn't the type of book to get me out of a reading slump. So that's not its fault. I'm absolutely going to read from this author again because I did recognize that this is a book that typically I would really, really enjoy. It is a very casually disturbing book. The protagonist sees some things and ends up in certain situations where she's very passive and you want her to act more strongly, but she's not going to. And there are a couple of things that happen where she's very much just the observer, and it's entered and written in such a way that you almost have to do a double take. Like you don't really know, as you're reading, all of a sudden this thing is thrown upon you and you have to go back and be like, what just happened? I'm missing something, like something big just happened, but we're already moved on from it. And so the way that was written was really, really interesting. So these 2 girls grow up in Texas, and they are brought up in a very wealthy environment because their father comes into oil money. And so money and kind of their position in society starts to play a really big part in their lives, and one of them rebels against it and one of them really just wants all of it. It's quite an interesting story, and it doesn't go where you think it's going to go. I have trouble really talking about this book because, like I said, I wasn't super engaged in reading while I was reading it, but I do think that if you like kind of a family story, a family drama, there's definitely some trauma involved, and there's the sister relationship is probably still a book that you would really enjoy. And like I said, I'm going to read from him again because I don't feel like I was able to give this book the best shot, but really interesting, and I'm glad that I picked it up. We then have Forbidden Notebook by Alba de Cespedes, translated by Anne Goldstein. Again, this is another book I have an entire video on, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But this book is spectacular. It just keeps growing and growing in my love for it as time moves on. It follows Valeria, who is a housewife. I say housewife, she does have a job outside of the home, but her entire identity is essentially wrapped up in being a housewife. And it is a very claustrophobic feeling book. It follows her story. She gets hold of this, she doesn't get a hold, she buys this notebook, she starts keeping a diary, and as she starts to write down things, more and more comes to light. She becomes more and more dissatisfied with where her life is. She becomes more and more concerned for her children, for her career, for her marriage. And it is a fascinating look at what this woman wants out of life and what she's getting out of life and what is expected of her. It's very, very good. It took me a little while to get into it, but I absolutely, by the end of it, absolutely loved it, and I imagine will be on one of my best books of the year, even though it was literally the first book that I read in 2024. The Art of Scandal by Regina Black. This is, what is the little timing thing? It's like a political romance thing. It got a lot of political scandal in it, essentially is what it is. You're following Rachel and Nate. Rachel is married, and she finds out that her husband is having an affair, and she basically blackmails him, says, I'll stay with you through the election if you give me $1 million and this house. And then Rachel meets Nate. Nate is an artist, and things happen. They percolate, and then they explode, and it is a romping time, essentially. I enjoyed it enough. It is very, very quick. It's sexy. It's a bit of an age gap. There's a lot going on, but it was just a fun read, and I think if you're looking for something to just sit down and enjoy, this could be it. Okay, Ashley Winstead, Midnight is the Darkest Hour. I have thoughts about this book, and I know that some people really didn't like it, but I enjoyed myself through this. It is, like, don't get me wrong, this book is utterly ridiculous. There is so much religious fanaticism in it, religious imagery. You are following Ruth and Everett, and they have been friends since childhood, and things are a little wild. The Twilight references are a little much, I'm not gonna lie, and the whole serial killer thing that's going on in here and where that goes is insane. But I like that the book essentially just dove in. They're like, this is going to be an absurd book. It's going to be absolutely ridiculous, and we're just going to go with it. And it does. So Ruth and Everett, there was a murder. Okay, let's start over. Ruth and Everett live in this very, very small, it is a very small town, and it is essentially controlled by the church. And these skulls start appearing in a pond, and people believe in this thing called the Low Man. And so they think something kind of supernatural is happening, but you know it's not supernatural, it's just people have been killed. And how Ruth and Everett are connected to these murders, it's crazy. It's just ridiculous. That is the word I would use to describe this book, utterly ridiculous. I thoroughly enjoyed myself, but I would go into it knowing that it's a very divisive book, as most of Ashley Winstead's books are. Like her previous one, The Last Housewife, I didn't like, but a lot of people did. And it seems to be, I'm watching the people that liked The Last Housewife didn't like this one, but I am the opposite. So I find that to be really interesting. I had a good time, super quick. It's big, but it was a quick read. But just know, it is an absurd book. We then have the ebooks that I read, so I don't have physical copies of them, but I read The Rise of Empire by Michael J. Sullivan. This is book 2 in the Ryria Revelations, or something like that. You're following Royce and Hadrian, and they are a couple of thieves for hire, but they work for the king, essentially, because of things that happened in book 1. And they end up on this quest. You follow Royce and Hadrian as they go on this ship. You follow a princess, Arista. You follow a girl whose name was Thrace, and they changed it in book 2 to, starts with an M, Molitor? I don't even remember. You're following all these different points of view because this kingdom is trying to save itself from being overtaken by this new empire that's being built up, essentially. and I still had a good time. I still liked the characters. I did find the book 2 dragged a tiny little bit for me with the Hadrian and Royce storyline just as they get on a ship. I kind of wanted that to pick up a little bit. I really enjoyed the storylines with the 2 women way better in this book. So that's interesting. I will eventually get to book 3. I have a lot of other stuff that is taking priority over book 3, but I enjoyed it. And if you like a nice, easy, the one thing I like about this is the world building is not so big. The magic and all that stuff is not so much that you're having to learn a whole lot to get into this story. So it is a smaller fantasy series, and I really do enjoy that. I read Stars in Your Eyes by Kacen Callender. This is a grumpy sunshine, forced dating, fake dating thing between 2 boys, 2 men, Maddie and Logan. Logan has a bit of a reputation. They're both actors, and they want Maddie and Logan to date to kind of improve Logan's reputation, but also help with the hype behind the movie that they're starring in together. This was fine. It was very full of conversations. Like, everything had to become capital C conversation. And while I understand that in real life you need to have open communication with your partner, when I'm reading, it becomes a little much that everything just becomes very heavy and full of learning. It was a little too much for me personally, but I can understand why people would like it because it is a romance book. I think some people really like that in their romances. When I decide to read a romance, I think I prefer something, I want substance, but I also want fun. And I think this one was lacking a little in the fun department, but it seems to be a pretty popular book. So again, I'm not exactly the right person to be going to for romance recommendations. That's just how I felt about this one. I am challenging myself this year to read some backlist books. And so the first book that I was able to get to this year was The Bean Trees by Barbara Kingsolver. Barbara Kingsolver has, I don't know, like 17 novels or something out, and I have read 2 of them, I think. I don't even remember The Poisonwood Bible. I know I read it. I don't remember anything about it. I will get to it eventually. But The Bean Trees, I believe, is her first full-length novel, and you are following Taylor as she moves to Arizona, and she kind of gets handed this child. It's an interesting encounter where she becomes the guardian to this child, and they end up in Arizona, found family. She's just trying to get by. I enjoyed it. It was small for Barbara Kingsolver, which I feel like happens a lot with authors as they become more and more prolific. Their books get longer. So The Bean Trees was fairly short, and it's just a coming of age sort of story. She's not like a teenager when this happens, but she's also not super old. And it's just an interesting look at a piece of her life in this moment where she becomes the guardian to this child and what that does to her and the other characters that come into her life. Barbara Kingsolver always writes beautifully, and this was no exception. And then finally, for this portion of the video, I read A Quitter's Paradise by Alicia Chang. This follows Eleanor, and she is a science lab technician assistant, and it's a very introspective book, and she's going through quite a bit in this. She's going through a lot of grief with her mother, and she has her whole family relationship dynamic is really messed up. She's married, and it's a look at those relationships, but I found her to be very one note. I was expecting more from this book, particularly because part of the blurb talks about how she kind of makes hilarious mistakes and hilarious decisions. And while yes, I can see where that would be true, the writing did not make it funny. So I found that those things to be really at odds with each other. I just didn't like how one note the main character seemed in this. So for me, it's a pass. Which is unfortunate because it's one of those books I had never heard of. I hadn't heard anybody talk about. It was on, where did I see it? I think it was just on a Barnes & Noble wall, and I decided to see if my library had it, and they did. But I don't know, it wasn't for me. I'll see if anybody else starts talking about it because it is a newer release, but so far I haven't seen anything. So I don't know that I will be in the majority or the minority on my feelings on this one, but I would say for me that's a pass. Okay, well, let's end this portion of the video with the 2 DNFs on this month. My first DNF was The House of Doors by 10/20. I'm so sad that this is a DNF. I waited for forever to get this from the library. I think this one was up for, was it the International Booker or something like that? Although, it just falls directly in line with the International Booker for me in 2023, where none of the books really worked for me. But you're following Willie and Leslie, and Leslie is a woman who's living in, where do they live? Penang. They're living in Penang, and Willie comes to visit them. Willie's a writer, and I think there's supposed to be some sort of intrigue about what Willie wants to write and what Leslie knows firsthand about what Willie wants to write about. I was so bored, I couldn't get into it. And so I got 124 pages in and was like, nope, I'm done. And then my other DNF was The Flea Palace by Elif Shafak. Elif Shafak is another author I would like to get to some of her backlist for. I believe The Flea Palace was her first book, and you can kind of tell it just wasn't very engaging. You're following a whole cast of characters who kind of live around this complex, I think. I didn't get as far into that one as I did with The House of Doors. I knew pretty quickly that it wasn't going to be for me, so I stepped away, but it just was too rambly. It jumped all over the place. It wasn't for me. That's okay. I will continue to read some books from her backlist and see where we end up. Anyways, for now, I'm going to call it quits, but I will see you in part 2 of this in a couple of weeks. Okay, we're back. Part 2. Cheers. Peppermint hot chocolate. It is not even that cold out, but for some reason I am freezing. I went for a run outside this morning. It was raining and my temperature just hasn't recovered. So we're going for the full hot chocolate. I have a handful of books to talk to you about for the rest of my January reading. Let me tell you though, the DNF train came fast and furious for the last few days of January since I finished part 1 of this, and it came hard. I'm in my era of if I'm not enjoying it, I'm not going to finish it. So we will get to those eventually, but let's start with a couple of successes. I posted a video at the beginning of the year, 24 book series for 2024. I got started on a couple of them. Red Rising, book 1. This follows Darrow. I think everybody and their mother knows what this book is about. Follows Darrow, who lives underground and thinks he is kind of sacrificing his life essentially to terraform what's above them. They need something. Turns out it's already been formed. Infiltration. Let me tell you, I enjoyed this. But the entire time, and like, please tell me if anybody else has the same thought. The entire time part of this book, for a large portion of the book where it is, Hunger Games. All I could do was compare it to the Hunger Games, and I don't know why, but for me, that comparison was so strong. I love the Hunger Games. It is one of the few YA book series that I would probably still read and love today, but I couldn't get over it. So I'm really excited to see where this one goes, and I'm hoping that that comparison lessens as the series moves forward, but I finally got to this. I'm very excited. And I finally, come on, you can be proud of me. I got through this. The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. Okay, this book is massive. Does it need to be this large? Probably not. Am I glad it is? I think so. It takes a little while to warm up to this world. Like, there are so many characters that you're following, so many points of view, that for me, it took me a little bit to really get into this world. And I kind of at one point was wondering if it was going to be worth the payoff. I think it is. Also, just as a note to all the authors out there, talking dragons is my love language. I love a good talking dragon. I like dragons. I think dragons is my bullet journal theme this year. Not this year, but this month. I have like some watercolor dragon sticker things that I made. I love them. And so this, very excited. At some point, I will get to book 2, but not immediately. Although I found out this book 2 is a prequel. So I'm not really sure like if there's going to be more in this, if it's just a duology. I have no idea what the story is behind this series. I think it's the Root of Chaos series or something like that. But so stoked to finally have finished that. I also read Minor Detail by Adania Shibli. This is a very small little book, and it is heartbreaking. So it follows there's a past timeline and a present timeline. It's about Palestinian occupation. or the occupation of Palestine is probably the more correct term. And at the beginning of the book, you're following an Israeli colonel, he's in the army for the Israeli army, and some really horrific things happen. And then there's a connection to the woman in the second part of the book. It is so brutal and so small, and it is definitely a book that I think everybody should at least attempt. I'm not saying everybody will love this book, you don't need to. One of my DNFs is in fact a book that I think a lot of people would say, Hope, you just need to struggle through and read it, but it wasn't for me. But this is so good, and if you would like to read a little bit about kind of the relationship between Palestine and Israel, this is definitely a nice, I would say easy, just in length, not easy in content, but potentially a good spot to start. Okay, get into a couple of DNFs. Lucky Dogs by Helen Schulman. The Breakup Tour by Emily Wilberly and Austin Sigmund Broca. These were so boring. This particularly was brutal because I just don't even really want to get into it because I've already spent way too much time on these books. But for me, they were hard passes. I also DNF'd What We Do to Our Friends by, let me see, I've got my story graph opened here. Oh, where'd it go? Oh, I know why. Pause. Okay. The Things We Do to Our Friends by Heather Darwent. I was just really bored reading this and ultimately decided it wasn't worth my time. And then this is the book that I feel terrible about DNFing, and it might maybe be one that I attempt again at another time. It could have just been my mood. Like I said earlier on about a couple of books, I was kind of feeling a little slumpy, and so I knew I was struggling through some books that I normally probably would have really loved, and this could have been part of that, and that is Gate of the Sun by Humphrey Davies. I think it's translated. So, Gate of the Sun by Elias Corey, and I think it must be translated by Humphrey Davies. And this is, again, it's another book about Israel and Palestine, and you're essentially following a man who is in a coma, and there's somebody sitting beside his bed, and he just starts telling this man's story. And I think that there is a lot of value to this book. I just was not in the space to be able to appreciate what I was reading, and I would read it for a bit and I'd put it away, and it would take me 3 days to want to go back to it. So for me, for now, it just isn't the right book for me at this time, but I think if that is, again, a subject that you're interested in, would absolutely be worth looking into. It is a beastly book though, it's big. And then quickly, just 3 more books to talk about. I read The Redemption of Galen Pike by Karis Davies. This is a short story collection. Short stories and I don't normally mix very well. And this one was fine. I can see why people would like it. This one is a legit short story collection, which I appreciate. I hate going into a short story collection and one of the stories is 150 pages long and the rest of them are like 10 pages. This one was definitely more like a collection of actual short stories, and I appreciated the writing, and there were some really great twists and turns. The story that is the name of this, The Redemption of Galen Pike, the twist at the end was kind of interesting. I think my favorite was the story from the beginning, because it kind of was not at all what I was expecting, and I really loved that. So in terms of short stories, this one was an absolute win, but it still isn't like a favorite book of mine. I read I'm reading the title. I should like pretend that I'm watching the camera. An Ordinary Violence by Adriana Chartrand, and this is about a girl who has to come back home, and her brother gets out of jail, and when he comes home, he brings a man with him, and things get creepy. This is classified as literary horror, and I am not a horror reader, so I knew going into this that I was prepared that I wasn't going to like it. I actually, in terms of the content, was fine with it. It doesn't get too horror-y. I would definitely call this horror light, because if I can read it, anybody can read it. But the underlying message, it's a lot about colonialism and appropriation, and things being stolen from you and identity. There's a lot going on, and I personally didn't grasp all of the metaphor and all the imagery, but it does get creepy enough. But I would say it is, if you're a fan of horror, this probably, if you're looking for actual horror, this might not be for you, but if you're looking for books that have a message, then this is probably one that is still worth your time. I enjoyed it. Again, it's just not really in a genre that I'm going to normally pick like my favorite book from, and it falls into that category, but I'm super glad I read it. And then finally, I read What a Match by Mimi Grace, and this follows, what are their names? I literally read it this morning. Like, it was a one sit down read for me, and I can't remember their names. Gwen and Anthony. You're following Gwen and Anthony. Gwen is trying to find her soulmate, her like forever partner, so she's on this dating app thing, one of the ones that you pay for, and Anthony has to crash on her couch. He is her brother's best friend, and you know, in a romance, like, obviously things are gonna happen, and they do. It gets sexy. It's, nothing really happens, like there's no real plot, but it's really just about these two people kind of figuring out their relationship. I think had it been any longer, it would have been too long. And again, it was fine. I didn't love it. I think that the chemistry between Gwen and Anthony was pretty decent. But in terms of like the story itself, I could have taken it or left it, but it was a really quick read, so I didn't DNF it because, like I said, it literally took like 2 hours for me to read this morning, so that's fine. And that wraps up January. Wild. I just want to say, I know it's the end, but Caitlin at Bandy's Books did a video the other day shouting out 24 new-ish booktubers to follow, and she included me in that list, and like, that is one of the nicest things anybody's ever done. And I just want to say, if you're here because of her, or if Caitlin, you yourself are watching, that is awesome and so nice, and I'm so stoked to have you, and it's just so nice that there's a community of book lovers out there that are just in this to find books or talk about books or expand their horizons, whatever the reason is for you being here. It's awesome. I'm so thrilled to have you, and I am so thrilled that she shouted out some people that I am going to, it's a long list, so it's going to take me a couple of days, but hopefully get through the list and find some new people to follow, because it's just a fun community, and I am thrilled to have been part of that video. So thank you so much. If I am ever in the position to pay that forward, I will do so. So thank you so much. I'm gonna call it. I'm gonna finish my hot chocolate. I want to know what your favorite book of January was. Did you read, have you read any of these actually, especially the DNFs? Like, let me know if you are in on my DNF train, or if you think I'm bananas for having not finished them. I would love to know. But cheers. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.